"You can't build that here." "Excuse me? That's my property line." "Not anymore." "Oh, approved it, get off my driveway." So, yeah, that was Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the neighborhood, screaming at me while standing inside a half-built garage that was, quite literally, sitting on my land. Hit that like button if you've ever met someone who believes rules apply to everyone except them. Subscribe for more stories where karma comes with heavy equipment. And grab your popcorn, because this HOA tyrant was about to find out what happens when you try to build your empire on another man's dirt, literally. When I first drove into Whispering Shores, the lake shimmered like polished glass, and the houses looked as though they'd been pulled straight from a postcard. It was the kind of neighborhood that made you think people left their doors unlocked and borrowed sugar without asking. The realtor had called it a quiet, upscale community with strong values, which, in hindsight, should have been my first warning. At the time, though, I was enchanted. After 10 years of working 60-hour weeks in the city, I wanted peace. I wanted mornings filled with the sound of gulls instead of traffic, and evenings that smelled of pine instead of exhaust. The cabin I bought sat right on the edge of the water, with its own narrow strip of shoreline and just enough distance from the nearest house to feel private. The moving truck arrived on a Saturday, and I remember thinking how perfect everything felt. Kids were riding bikes along the cul-de-sac, someone was grilling burgers 2 houses down, and a couple waved from their porch as if they actually meant it. For the first few hours, I believed I had finally found the calm I'd been chasing. Then, a silver SUV rolled slowly past my driveway. It paused just long enough for the driver to lower her sunglasses and give me a look that made my skin tighten. It wasn't curiosity, it was assessment. The kind of look a manager gives a new employee she already doesn't like. I brushed it off, kept unloading boxes, and told myself small towns just had nosy neighbors. By evening, when I carried the last lamp inside, that same SUV came by again. This time, it stopped completely. The driver stepped out, a woman in a pastel blouse and white capris, clipboard in hand, posture so rigid she could have balanced a book on her head. She didn't introduce herself. She didn't ask if I needed help. She simply looked over my yard, made a note on her clipboard, and said, "We have very high standards here. You'll want to familiarize yourself with our expectations." Then she turned, walked back to her car, and drove away without another word. That was my introduction to Karen. At that moment, I didn't realize she wasn't just a neighbor. She was the self-appointed guardian of every blade of grass, every fence post, and every inch of property in Whispering Shores. I thought I'd moved into paradise, but I had unknowingly stepped into her kingdom. For the first week, I convinced myself that the encounter with Karen was nothing more than a misunderstanding. Maybe she was just one of those overly invested residents who loved her neighborhood a little too much. I tried to focus on what had brought me there in the first place. Every morning, the lake looked like a sheet of silver as the sun rose, and the quiet rhythm of the water made the world feel manageable again. I'd sit on the back porch with my coffee, listening to the faint rustle of pine trees and the distant sound of someone's boat engine starting. It was supposed to be my reward after years of chasing deadlines and living out of suitcases. Whispering Shores was meant to be a place where I could finally breathe. Inside, the house felt like a dream I'd built out of every moment I'd ever wanted to slow down. I'd painted the walls in warm colors, unpacked the old fishing rods my father left me, and lined the shelves with books that had been boxed up for years. The air smelled faintly of cedar and coffee, and in the evenings I'd leave the windows open just to hear the frogs and crickets begin their nightly chorus. For a while, I believed I had found exactly what I needed. Then, little by little, I began to notice the eyes. It wasn't paranoia, it was presence. Whenever I stepped outside, there always seemed to be someone watching, a curtain shifting across the street, a car parked too long at the corner, and every so often, that same silver SUV creeping by at a snail's pace. Karen never waved. She simply drove past, eyes hidden behind her sunglasses, scanning every detail of my property as if memorizing it for later review. Once, while trimming the hedges, I looked up and saw her standing on her porch with a measuring tape, jotting something down. When she noticed me watching, she smiled tightly and went inside. I told myself not to read into it. New neighbors bring curiosity. But there was something different about the way she studied everything I did. It wasn't curiosity or concern, it was calculation. Each quiet morning on the porch began to feel less like peace and more like preparation for whatever invisible test she believed I was failing. I still thought Whispering Shores was a sanctuary, but the illusion of calm was starting to crack. The first notice appeared on my door one Tuesday morning. It was neatly folded, tucked into a clear plastic sleeve, and sealed with a sticker that read, Homeowners Association Official Correspondence. At first, I thought it was a welcome letter, or maybe an invitation to some community event. I had been there only a few weeks and still wanted to make a good impression. When I opened it, though, the tone was anything but welcoming. The letter began with Dear Resident and continued with an accusation that my property violated neighborhood landscaping standards. It claimed that my grass exceeded the allowable height by 2 inches, and that I was required to submit a written plan for corrective action within 5 days. I actually laughed out loud at the absurdity of it. My lawn was freshly cut, perfectly even, and greener than any I'd had in years. I thought about ignoring it. Surely, someone in the office would realize the mistake and apologize. But when I stopped by the HOA office later that afternoon, I realized exactly who was behind it. Karen sat at a desk near the window, her posture flawless, her nameplate gleaming in the sunlight. She looked up with a smile, so polite it could slice glass. Ah, Mr. Bennett, she said, as though she had been expecting me. You received your first notice. It's nothing personal, of course. We simply hold our residents to a certain standard. She said it with such smooth certainty that it almost sounded reasonable. Almost. When I pointed out that the grass was fine and offered to show her photos, she glanced at the images with the kind of indifference people reserve for junk mail. Perception is important, she said. It isn't about whether your lawn is technically within limits. It's about maintaining visual harmony. That phrase, visual harmony, stuck in my head all day. It sounded less like a community rule and more like a cult slogan. 2 days later, a second notice appeared. This one accused me of using non-approved outdoor lighting. The so-called violation was a small solar lantern I'd placed near the walkway. I started to understand then that these notices weren't about regulations. They were about control. Karen wasn't enforcing rules for the good of the neighborhood. She was establishing dominance, one letter at a time. Whispering Shores wasn't being managed. It was being ruled. And I had just become her newest project. I first heard Karen before I saw her. It was a Saturday morning in late spring, the kind of morning when the lake lay still and the air felt heavy with quiet. I was halfway through my coffee when a sharp metallic screech broke the calm. At first, I thought it was some kind of bird call. Then I realized it was a megaphone. Attention, residents of Whispering Shores, a voice declared, echoing across the neighborhood like an air raid siren. Friendly reminder that trash cans must be removed from site by 8 a.m. Sharp. I walked to the window, and there she was, standing in the middle of the cul-de-sac, one hand on her hip and the other gripping the megaphone like a weapon. She wore a crisp white visor, matching sneakers, and the confident expression of someone who believed she was keeping civilization intact. 2 small children rode by on bikes, staring at her in disbelief. Their mother hurried them along, pretending not to notice. Over the next week, the megaphone became the soundtrack of my mornings. Karen used it for everything. She announced lawn inspections, reminded people to roll up garden hoses, and once scolded a man for leaving his garage door open too long. I couldn't tell if she saw herself as a leader or a performer, but she carried herself with the energy of someone starring in a show only she had auditioned for. At first, I found it almost funny. Her announcements came with the kind of seriousness usually reserved for public safety emergencies. This is a courtesy reminder, she would say, that decorative bird feeders are limited to 1 per household. She spoke as if she were broadcasting from Mission Control, saving the neighborhood from chaos, 1 proclamation at a time. But the humor wore off quickly. The megaphone was more than a nuisance. It was a declaration of power. She wanted everyone to hear her, to know that she was watching and recording and ready to enforce whatever rules she deemed important that day. One evening, as the sun went down, I stood on my porch and watched her pace her driveway, megaphone in hand, checking the reflection of her own voice against the calm water of the Dakov lake. It struck me then that Karen didn't just live in Whispering Shores. She commanded it, like a general guarding her kingdom from invisible threats. It was a windy afternoon when I noticed the first orange stake. It stood near the edge of my driveway, bright against the green grass, with a thin ribbon fluttering like a warning flag. At first, I thought it was something left behind by a utility crew, maybe a marker for underground cables. But the next day, there were 3 more, perfectly aligned, forming a neat border that didn't quite match my property line. I walked around them, trying to make sense of their placement. They cut diagonally across my front yard and disappeared behind a cluster of pine trees that marked the boundary with Karen's property. That evening, I saw her outside with a clipboard, crouched near the final stake. She was measuring the distance with a tape, jotting down numbers, her concentration so intense that she didn't even notice me standing a few yards away. When I asked what she was doing, she looked up with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Just ensuring compliance with the neighborhood development plan," she said. The words sounded official, but the tone was defensive. "Nothing for you to worry about. It's all standard procedure." Then she stood, dusted off her knees, and walked away without another word. The next morning, 2 men in reflective vests arrived in a pickup truck marked Community Improvement Project. They unloaded wooden planks and survey equipment, working quietly while Karen supervised from her lawn. I approached them to ask for clarification, but they directed all questions to her. She waved from across the hedge, insisting it was just routine spatial maintenance, whatever that meant. Later that night, I dug out the survey map that had come with my house documents. The lines were clear, the measurements exact. Every stake Karen had planted was several feet inside my property. She wasn't maintaining anything. She was preparing something. The stakes multiplied over the next few days. I'd leave for errands and return to find new ones sprouting from the ground, each marked with fresh paint and coded numbers. Neighbors began whispering about a rumored storage structure or an HOA expansion. I didn't know what to believe. All I knew was that Karen had laid claim to a piece of my land, one stake at a time. The quiet neighborhood that once felt safe now looked like a battlefield in progress. The sound came first, a deep mechanical rumble that shook the stillness of dawn. I stepped outside in my robe, half convinced it was thunder, and found a bulldozer parked in front of my house. Its yellow frame gleamed in the early light, the engine idling like a creature waiting for command. Standing beside it, clipboard in hand, was Karen. Her hair was perfectly arranged, her clothes immaculate, and her smile unsettlingly cheerful. "Good morning," she said, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. "We're beginning the first phase of construction." I blinked at her, trying to process what I was seeing. "Construction of what?" I asked. She gestured toward the row of orange stakes that still dotted the lawn. "The Community Improvement Initiative. This area has been selected for a new storage and maintenance facility. The board approved it last week." She said it with the kind of authority that made it sound final. The only problem was that the land she was pointing to was mine. When I told her that, she laughed softly, as though I had made a charming mistake. "Property boundaries can be confusing," she said. "Don't worry, I've handled all the permits." She waved a folder in the air, its pages filled with forms stamped with the HOA's logo. None of them bore any signatures from the county or from me. The men operating the machinery looked uncomfortable, exchanging uncertain glances. One of them shut off the engine, perhaps sensing that the situation was not as legitimate as Karen made it sound. I called the county office while she stood there, pretending to be busy directing the workers. The clerk confirmed what I already suspected. No permits had been filed for any construction within Whispering Shores. Whatever Karen was doing, she was doing it without legal authority. When I relayed that to her, her pleasant tone cracked for the first time. "You're obstructing community progress," she snapped. "If you don't cooperate, the board will issue a fine." The workers packed up soon after, muttering apologies before driving away. Karen stayed long enough to photograph my driveway and shake her head as if disappointed in my lack of civic spirit. As the bulldozer disappeared down the street, I realized the peaceful life I had imagined was gone. Karen had declared a new kind of war, one fought with paper, noise, and intimidation, and the first battle had just been waged on my front lawn. The following morning, I found a thick envelope taped to my front door. It was sealed with an HOA stamp and labeled "Notice of Legal Violation." Inside was a packet of papers written in dense, bureaucratic language that managed to sound both official and absurd. The first page accused me of interfering with authorized development work and warned that continued obstruction could result in fines and legal action. I stared at the words in disbelief. Karen had not only trespassed on my land, but had somehow twisted the situation into a legal threat against me. I walked straight to her house, with the envelope still in my hand. She answered before I even knocked, as if she had been waiting. Her expression was serene, her voice calm, but there was triumph hiding just beneath the surface. "I assume you received the documentation," she said. I asked her how she could possibly justify filing a violation against the actual property owner. She tilted her head slightly, her smile unwavering. "The association has the right to enforce community standards. If your behavior disrupts scheduled improvements, that falls under the category of non-compliance." The words, community standards, sounded hollow in her mouth. I told her that no county office recognized her project, that she had no legal standing to build anything, and that her actions constituted trespassing. She dismissed my argument with a small laugh. "Oh, you'll want to read Section 12B of the bylaws," she said, retrieving a bright pink binder from a nearby table. She flipped to a page and pointed at a paragraph printed in bold. It read, "All adjacent properties may be reclassified for communal use when deemed beneficial by the HOA board." The clause looked suspiciously new. The text was a different font, and the ink had a fresh sheen. "Who approved this?" I asked. She met my eyes without blinking. "The board," she said simply, "and I am the board." I walked home feeling both angry and astonished. It was clear that Karen wasn't just breaking rules, she was rewriting them in real time. Her confidence came from years of no one standing up to her. The papers on my kitchen table weren't about governance or improvement. They were her weapon of choice, forged from paper and arrogance. That night, as I reread the fabricated clause, I made a quiet promise to myself. The next move would not be hers. 2 days later, a white pickup truck rolled up to my property with a magnetic sign that read, "Harrison Land Surveying." The man who stepped out looked like someone who had spent his life outdoors. His face was weathered, his clothes streaked with dust, and he carried a clipboard that had seen better days. He introduced himself as Luke and asked if I was the homeowner who had requested a boundary verification. I nodded and led him toward the cluster of orange stakes that had become a permanent fixture in my yard. He studied them for a moment, then frowned. "These aren't positioned by any professional," he said quietly. "They're too close together, and whoever did this doesn't know how to read a topographic map." For the next hour, I followed him as he worked. His precision was methodical, the metal stakes clicking against stone as he moved along the perimeter. Every so often, he would stop, jot something on his clipboard, and shake his head. Finally, he looked up with a wry smile. "Well, I'll give you the good news first. Your property extends 6 feet beyond where your fence line ends. The bad news is that the neighbor's new construction sits squarely inside that space." He paused, letting the words settle. "To put it simply, part of her foundation is on your land." Hearing it said out loud made the situation feel heavier. Until that moment, I had thought Karen's actions were just another power trip, a performance to show the neighborhood who was in charge. Now, it was tangible. She had physically built on my property. Luke handed me a stamped report and assured me it was legally binding. "You've got the documentation you need," he said. "If she argues, show her this. It'll hold up anywhere." That evening, I walked across the street and caught Karen watering her flowers. I told her about the survey results, expecting at least a flicker of embarrassment or regret. Instead, she smiled faintly, almost with amusement. "Well, then I suppose you'll just have to share," she said. Her tone was light, but her eyes were sharp. I went back inside and placed the survey folder on my kitchen counter. The weight of it felt like more than paper. It was proof, undeniable and solid, that she had crossed from nuisance into violation. But for Karen, rules had always been optional. When I confronted Karen the next morning, I tried to stay calm. I carried the survey report in one hand and my phone in the other, just in case the conversation took a familiar turn toward chaos. She was outside again, wearing gardening gloves and trimming the hedges as if nothing in the world could disturb her peace. I called her name and handed her a copy of the document. She took it, skimmed the first page, and then looked at me with a small, practiced smile. "Oh, this again," she said. "You really should let this go. Property lines are just numbers on paper." I told her those numbers came from a licensed surveyor and that the report proved she had built 6 feet into my land. She raised an eyebrow and gave a soft laugh that didn't match the sharpness in her eyes. "You men and your measurements," she said, waving the papers like they were flyers for a yard sale. "The garage is practically finished. It would be such a waste to undo all that work." Her voice was smooth, but there was something deliberate about the way she positioned herself between me and the half-built structure. The foundation extended beyond the stakes now, the concrete slab stretching boldly across what was legally mine. "You'll need to remove it," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "You can't just build wherever you want because it's convenient." Karen sighed, removing her gloves one finger at a time, as if she were preparing for a speech. "You're new here," she began. "You don't understand how this community operates. We value cooperation. If you make this difficult, you'll only isolate yourself." The word isolate hung in the air, soft but heavy. I reminded her that laws applied to everyone, even her. She smiled again, though it looked forced this time. "The HOA board has already approved it," she said. "So, unless you'd like to take your argument up with them, I suggest you stop wasting everyone's time." Then she turned her back and began sweeping the driveway with deliberate slowness. I stood there for a moment, watching her pretend to clean, and felt the frustration rise like heat under my skin. It wasn't just arrogance anymore, it was ownership. She believed that if she acted with enough confidence, no one would challenge her. But she had built her confidence, like her garage, on my land. And I was done being quiet. By the time I called the police, I had documented everything. Photographs of the survey stakes, the garage foundation, and the written report from Luke were all neatly arranged in a folder on my kitchen table. I told myself I wasn't looking for a fight, only for fairness. The dispatcher said an officer would be there within the hour. When the patrol car finally pulled into the neighborhood, I felt both relief and apprehension. The officer stepped out, adjusted his cap, and introduced himself as Officer Daniels. His expression was polite but weary, like someone who had seen every variety of neighborhood feud imaginable. Before I could explain, Karen appeared from behind her hedge, smiling as if she had been expecting him. "Officer," she called out, "thank goodness you're here. He's been harassing me again." Her voice carried down the street, and within minutes, a few curious neighbors had appeared at their windows. Daniels turned toward me, his eyebrows raised slightly, as if to ask whether this was a regular occurrence. I handed him the folder. "She's built a structure on my property," I said. "Here's the proof." He studied the papers, nodding slowly. Karen kept talking, describing me as unstable, aggressive, and unwilling to cooperate with community standards. When she saw him reading, she softened her tone and began using words like misunderstanding and administrative error. Daniels finally looked up from the documents and said, "Ma'am, this report shows that part of your construction does cross onto your neighbor's property. Did you obtain a permit for this?" Her composure cracked for a moment. "The HOA approved it," she said quickly. Daniels glanced back at the papers, then at me. "The HOA doesn't have authority over land boundaries," he said evenly. "This is a civil matter, but I'd advise you to stop construction until this is resolved." Karen's jaw tightened, and her voice dropped to a near whisper. "You don't understand. This neighborhood has rules." "I understand," he replied, "but the law outranks your rules." As he drove away, I noticed Karen standing perfectly still, the wind tugging at the edges of her blouse. Her mask of confidence had slipped just enough for me to see something new behind it. Fear, or maybe disbelief, that someone had finally told her no. For the first time since I moved in, the silence of Whispering Shores felt like mine again. That evening, just as the sun began to dip behind the trees, my neighbor Carl wandered over, carrying 2 beers and a look that said he'd been waiting for an excuse to talk. I had seen him a few times, usually tending to his garden or waving from across the street, but we had never exchanged more than a few polite words. He handed me a bottle, leaned against the railing of my porch, and said, "You're not the first one she's pulled this on." His tone carried a mix of sympathy and exasperation. I asked him what he meant, and he took a long sip before answering. "Karen's been trying to expand that garage for years. Every time someone new moves into the neighborhood, she finds a way to use their property. Sometimes it's a fence line, sometimes it's landscaping, and now it's you." He shook his head. "She tells everyone the HOA approved it, but the board is just her and 2 friends who nod whenever she talks. Most people give up because it isn't worth the hassle. I told him that wasn't an option for me, not after everything I'd seen her do. He nodded like he had expected that answer. Good, he said. Because she's been bragging for months that she was going to build that garage, no matter who moved in next. Said the land should have been hers all along. You're just the unlucky guy who showed up after she made her plans. Hearing it laid out so plainly made the situation feel even more absurd. I asked him if anyone had ever tried to challenge her officially. He let out a quiet laugh. A couple of folks did. One family down the street hired a lawyer, but they moved out before the case went anywhere. She has a way of wearing people down. If you stay long enough, she'll find some rule to turn against you. We sat in silence for a while, the evening breeze carrying the scent of the lake across the yard. The surface of the water shimmered like glass, calm and untouched, a stark contrast to the tension building in our quiet neighborhood. Carl finally finished his beer, set the bottle on the railing, and said, "If you're planning to fight her, make sure you've got more than just proof. You'll need patience too. She never quits, and she never apologizes." Then he walked home, leaving me with the feeling that I was about to become part of a story much older than my arrival. A few days later, I received an email from the HOA labeled Emergency Session Notification. The message was written in the formal, slightly patronizing tone that had become familiar. It announced a mandatory meeting to discuss a serious neighborhood dispute affecting community unity. I didn't need to guess who had called it. The meeting was scheduled for that evening at the community clubhouse. Part of me wanted to ignore it, but curiosity won out. If Karen wanted a public confrontation, I was ready to give her one. When I arrived, the room was already half full. Neighbors sat in folding chairs, whispering among themselves, while Karen stood at the front beside a large projector screen. She wore a navy blazer, her posture as straight as ever, and her expression carefully composed. On the screen behind her was a slide titled Unauthorized Land Encroachment and Community Safety Concerns. My name appeared underneath in bold letters. The sight of it sent a ripple of laughter through a few people in the back, but most just looked uncomfortable. Karen cleared her throat and began her presentation as though she were addressing a corporate board. It has come to the HOA's attention that certain residents have failed to comply with community property regulations, she said, clicking to the next slide, which displayed photographs of my yard and driveway. Each picture was marked with arrows and captions, accusing me of violating unspecified guidelines. "We must maintain order and harmony in Whispering Shores," she continued, "and that requires collective accountability." I waited until she finished before standing. "If we're talking about accountability," I said, "then maybe we should start with the fact that your garage is sitting on land you don't own." A murmur ran through the room. Karen's jaw tightened, but she forced a smile. "That's an ongoing administrative matter," she replied smoothly. I held up the surveyor's report for everyone to see. "This isn't administrative, it's legal. You're trespassing." The projector light flickered across her face, revealing the faintest crack in her confidence. For a brief moment, the room shifted. People who had been quiet began whispering again, this time not about me. Karen hurried through the rest of her slides, skipping entire sections. By the time she ended the meeting, the audience had already begun filing out. The illusion of her authority had started to waver, and for the first time since I moved in, she looked unsure of her footing. That night, still buzzing from the meeting, I decided to review the footage from the security cameras I had installed around the property. I hadn't expected to find anything useful, but curiosity kept me awake. The system stored recordings for 2 weeks, and since the construction had started less than that, everything was still there. I poured a cup of coffee, sat at my desk, and began scrolling through the timeline. Most of it was uneventful. The mailman, a few passing cars, and the reflection of the lake rippling under the sundae. Then I noticed something odd. Around midnight, 3 days before the meeting, the motion sensors near the boundary line had triggered. The camera showed 2 men working quietly in the dark. They wore reflective vests and carried flashlights, moving with the speed of people who didn't want to be seen. One of them operated a concrete mixer, while the other spread the mixture along the line of orange stakes. In the faint glow of their lights, I could see Karen standing a few yards away, her arms folded, giving instructions. The scene felt surreal. She wasn't just approving the construction, she was orchestrating it. The clock on the footage read 12:47 a.m. I paused the video and stared at the screen. Every image confirmed what I had suspected. She knew exactly what she was doing. I saved the clip, backed it up on 2 drives, and made several still images to print later. As I continued reviewing the footage, I noticed that the same crew returned 2 more nights that week, each time adding to the foundation. It was clear they were trying to complete as much work as possible before anyone noticed. The next morning, I walked to the edge of the property and found faint tire marks leading to the construction site. The concrete had hardened, smooth and pale under the sun, stretching several feet into my yard. Standing there, I could almost hear the quiet hum of the machines from the footage. The thought that she had carried out the entire operation under the cover of darkness filled me with disbelief. It was no longer just arrogance, it was deliberate deception. The evidence I held in my hands wasn't just proof of trespassing, it was a record of intent. For the first time, I had something Karen couldn't talk her way out of. The morning after I discovered the footage, I stepped outside to find a mess waiting for me. My mailbox leaned at an awkward angle, the post split near the base, and one of the hinges on the door hung loose. A can of spray paint had been used to scrawl the word "rule breaker" across the front of my garbage bin in bright red letters. The paint dripped down the sides, still fresh enough to stain my fingers when I touched it. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and wet concrete. I stood there for a moment, taking it all in, and felt that familiar tightness in my chest that comes when anger and disbelief mix. Karen appeared a few minutes later, dressed as neatly as always, holding a mug of coffee and pretending to be surprised. "Oh my goodness," she said, her voice thick with false concern. "Vandalism? What a shame. Some people just don't respect community standards." She didn't even bother hiding her smirk. I took a slow breath and asked if she had seen anything during the night. She looked thoughtful for a moment, then shook her head. "No, but you should probably report it to the HOA. They take these matters very seriously." The implication hung between us like smoke. She wanted me to think she was untouchable, that every rule and every piece of paper somehow bent in her favor. I spent the afternoon photographing the damage and filing a report with the police. The officer who arrived listened patiently, then gave me a sympathetic look. "We can file it, but without witnesses it'll be hard to prove who did it," he said. "You might want to keep an eye out." He didn't need to say whose eye he meant. Later that evening, I walked the perimeter of the property, checking every camera angle to make sure nothing else had been tampered with. The lake was calm, reflecting the orange glow of the sunset, and the sound of cicadas filled the air. I should have felt peaceful, but all I could think about was how far she was willing to go to protect her illusion of control. The mailbox, the spray paint, the petty destruction, it was all meant as a warning. She wanted to remind me who she thought ran Whispering Shores. But what she didn't realize was that her threats no longer scared me. They only gave me more reason to fight back. That night, I gathered every document, photograph, and video file into one folder on my laptop. The evidence filled more than 2 gigabytes, a collection of every lie Karen had told wrapped neatly in digital order. I had already spoken to a lawyer earlier that afternoon, a man named Stephen Reynolds, who specialized in property disputes. When I told him the story, he laughed once, quietly, as though he couldn't believe how far she had taken it. "You could sue her for encroachment and damages," he said, "and you'd win. The footage alone would bury her." Then he paused, leaning back in his chair. "But something tells me that's not the outcome you're looking for." He was right. I didn't want a court battle that would drag on for months while the half-built garage stood as a monument to her arrogance. I wanted something that made a point faster and with more precision. When I mentioned the idea of relocation, his eyebrows lifted. "You mean moving it?" he asked. "Physically?" I nodded. "You own the land. Anything sitting on it without permission is legally yours to remove. Just make sure you document the process." His tone carried both amusement and caution. That evening, I called my cousin Mike, who ran a small construction and towing company 2 towns over. He had the kind of practical humor that could survive any situation. When I told him about Karen's garage, there was a long silence, then a low whistle. "You're telling me she built half a building on your land?" he said. "That's not a problem, that's an opportunity." We met at my house the next morning. Mike inspected the structure, running his hand along the concrete foundation and tapping one of the beams. "It's solid enough to move," he said. "We'll need a flatbed, some jacks, and a few guys who won't ask questions." The plan began to form right there in the sunlight, simple and outrageous at the same time. Before he left, Mike looked back at the garage and grinned. "You sure you want to go through with this?" he asked. I nodded without hesitation. I was tired of being pushed around, tired of pretending her rules meant anything. For the first time since I moved to Whispering Shores, I felt in control again. Karen had built her monument on my land, and soon it would be gone, just not in the way she expected. Mike arrived early Saturday morning with 2 trucks, a small crew, and the kind of confidence that only comes from years of handling impossible jobs. The sun was still low over the lake, turning the water gold and quiet. He stepped out of his truck, clapped his hands together, and said, "Let's make history." His men laughed, but I could tell they were intrigued. Few people get to move a garage as an act of revenge. We started by loosening the frame. The walls were still incomplete, and the roof hadn't been sealed, which made the process easier. Mike's crew worked with practiced precision, removing bolts and lifting panels while I filmed everything for legal protection. The metallic clatter of tools echoed across the neighborhood. A few curious residents peeked through curtains, drawn by the noise. I half expected Karen to appear, but her house remained strangely still. By mid-morning, the structure was ready. Mike guided the hydraulic jacks under the base, testing the weight, then motioned for the flatbed to back up slowly. The engine hummed as steel chains clinked into place. It was a delicate operation, one mistake away from disaster, yet it unfolded with surprising smoothness. The garage began to rise inch by inch, its shadow shifting over the ground like a living thing being uprooted. When the frame finally settled onto the player truck, Mike stepped back and whistled. "There it is," he said, "one portable ego, ready for relocation." I couldn't help but laugh, the sound light and unfamiliar after so many tense weeks. Watching that structure lifted from my land felt like shedding a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying. We paused for lunch, sitting on the edge of the dock with sandwiches and bottled water. The plan was simple: move the garage to the shallow end of the lake, where it could rest securely without damaging anything. From a distance, it would look like a floating shed. From up close, it would look like justice. As the afternoon light shifted, Mike glanced toward Karen's house. "You sure she's not going to call the cops?" he asked. I smiled and held up my phone, displaying the legal notice from my attorney, confirming my rights to remove unauthorized structures. "If she does," I said, "they'll tell her the same thing everyone else has been trying to. She built it on the wrong side of the line." By sunset, the trucks were ready to move. The lake shimmered with streaks of orange and violet, calm and endless, as if it were waiting for the spectacle. Mike's crew worked in near silence now, their focus sharp and deliberate. The garage sat strapped to the flatbed like a giant trophy, its half-finished walls glowing faintly in the fading light. I walked around it one last time, making sure every strap was secured. The air smelled of mud, gasoline, and pine. Mike wiped his hands on a rag and pointed toward the water. "You're sure about the spot?" he asked. I nodded. The area near the dock was shallow enough to hold the structure without sinking completely. From there, it would be visible to anyone driving past the neighborhood entrance. It wasn't destruction I wanted, it was visibility. I wanted everyone to see the symbol of her arrogance reflected in the same lake she bragged about protecting. The truck's engine roared to life, cutting through the still evening air. Slowly, it began to roll forward, its tires crunching over the gravel. The movement drew the attention of several neighbors who stepped onto their porches, whispering among themselves. They probably thought it was another one of Karen's projects, until they saw me walking beside the truck. A few even started recording on their phones. When the flatbed reached the shoreline, Mike's crew moved with precision. The jacks lowered, the chains released, and the garage tilted slightly as it was eased onto the waiting water. For a moment, it teetered on the edge, the reflection rippling beneath it. Then, with a gentle splash, it settled into place. The sound echoed across the water like a sigh of relief. I stood at the dock, watching as the garage floated steady and unmoving, its base half submerged but perfectly balanced. The crew cheered quietly, the tension dissolving into laughter. Mike clapped me on the shoulder and said, "Well, that's one way to solve a property dispute." The sky deepened into twilight, and the first stars began to appear. Across the street, Karen's house remained dark. I wondered if she knew yet, or if she would discover it in the morning. Either way, the sight that awaited her would be unforgettable. Her stolen garage now belonged to the lake, a monument to her own undoing. The next morning, I woke to the sound of shouting. At first, it was faint, carried by the breeze coming off the lake, but it grew louder by the second. I stepped onto the porch and saw Karen standing at the shoreline in a bathrobe, her hair tangled, her voice echoing across the water. The garage sat exactly where we had left it, calm and perfectly still, the early sunlight turning its reflection into gold. She paced back and forth, waving her arms and yelling words I couldn't quite make out, though I caught enough to know the gist. My name was repeated several times, along with a creative selection of insults. Neighbors had, already gathered, drawn by the commotion. Some stood on their lawns, pretending to check their mail, others filmed quietly from a distance. Karen turned toward the crowd, pointing an accusatory finger at me, as if she were addressing a jury. "He stole my property," she cried. "He dumped it in the lake. This is environmental vandalism." Her voice cracked on the last word. I walked down to the edge of my yard, keeping my tone even. "Actually," I said, "I relocated my property. You built it on my land without permission." I simply corrected the mistake. Laughter rippled through the watching crowd, small and cautious at first, but enough to make her face flush with fury. She demanded that someone call the police, and within minutes, a patrol car pulled up. It was Officer Daniels again, stepping out with the same weary expression he'd worn the last time. He looked from Karen to me, then at the floating garage. "I'm going to guess this has something to do with your ongoing disagreement," he said. Karen rushed forward, waving her hands, explaining how I had destroyed community property. Daniels listened for a moment, then turned to me. "Do you have proof this was on your land?" I handed him a copy of the survey report and the photos of the construction. He studied them, then sighed. "Ma'am, the structure was illegally placed. He had every right to remove it." Karen went silent. For the first time, she seemed at a loss for words. Daniels tipped his hat to me and drove away, leaving her standing by the water, staring at the floating monument of her own making. The neighborhood watched in silence as the morning breeze carried the faint sound of her disbelief across the lake. The sight of her that morning was something I will never forget. Karen stood at the edge of the lake, her reflection rippling across the surface beside the garage she had claimed as her own. Her robe was soaked at the hem, her hands clenched at her sides, and her expression was caught somewhere between outrage and confusion. The neighborhood had gathered behind her, a semicircle of quiet witnesses who no longer seemed sure which side to take. Some looked amused, others looked uneasy, but no one moved to help her. She shouted again, this time directly at me. "You think this is funny?" she said. "You've ruined everything." Her voice cracked, carried by the wind. I walked down the slope until I was standing a few feet from her. "You said it was community property," I said. "So I made it available to everyone." For a moment, she didn't seem to understand. Then her eyes flicked from me to the garage and back again, and I could see the realization forming. Behind us, a neighbor let out a low chuckle that quickly turned into laughter. Another joined in, and soon the tension broke. Karen's face flushed crimson as she realized the audience was no longer hers. Her authority had been chipped away piece by piece, and this moment was the final blow. She turned sharply toward the crowd, trying to recover. "This isn't over," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll take this to the board." But even as she said it, the words sounded hollow. A man from 2 houses down called back, "You are the board, Karen." The laughter returned, louder this time, and she spun around and marched back toward her house, her steps quick and uneven. I stayed by the water for a while after she left, watching the garage float in the sunlight. It sat perfectly still, a strange and beautiful reflection of everything that had gone wrong between us. A pair of ducks landed nearby, gliding past it without concern. The absurdity of it all struck me then, and I laughed quietly to myself. For the first time since moving to Whispering Shores, I felt the kind of peace I had imagined when I first bought the place. The lake was calm, the air was clean, and for once, Karen was silent. By the afternoon, the story of the floating garage had spread through the entire neighborhood. People were walking their dogs just to get a glimpse of it, phones in hand, snapping pictures as if it were a tourist attraction. From my porch, I could hear fragments of conversation drifting on the breeze. Words like karma and finally mixed with laughter. For once, the sound of Whispering Shores wasn't Karen's voice echoing through her megaphone, but the quiet murmur of neighbors sharing relief. I knew it couldn't last. By sunset, a new envelope appeared on my door. The HOA letterhead was printed in bold, and the notice inside accused me of committing unauthorized aquatic modification and disrupting the aesthetic harmony of the lake. The fine listed at the bottom was $5,000. I read it twice before I started laughing. She had gone from pretending to enforce the law to inventing her own version of maritime regulation. The next day, I mailed her a letter in return. It was short and to the point. I included a copy of the property survey, the police report, and an invoice for the removal of her illegal structure. The total came to just under $7,000. The message at the bottom read, "Payment due within 10 business days." I dropped it in her mailbox myself, making sure the red flag was raised. When the HOA meeting was called that week, the turnout was the largest anyone could remember. Karen arrived with her usual binder of papers, prepared for another performance, but the energy in the room had shifted. People were tired of her control. They had watched her manipulate rules, insult neighbors, and now humiliate herself in front of the entire community. The board vote was quick and final, 3-2 in favor of her removal as president. She left without saying a word. The silence that followed her departure felt almost fragile, like the first breath after a storm. Later that night, I walked down to the lake. The garage still floated in its place, moonlight, glinting across the water. For the first time, it no longer looked like a symbol of conflict. It looked like balance, a strange kind of justice resting quietly under the stars. It didn't take long for the story to leave the boundaries of Whispering Shores. Someone had filmed the entire scene from their porch, from the moment the garage began to move until it settled on the lake. The video opened with the sound of the truck's engine and ended with Karen's voice echoing in disbelief. Within 24 hours, it appeared on social media under the title, "Neighborhood Karen Gets a Floating Surprise." By morning, it had reached 1 million views. At first, I didn't know it had gone viral. My phone started buzzing nonstop with messages from friends I hadn't spoken to in years. "Is this you?" they asked, sending links to the video. I opened one and saw myself standing at the dock, watching as the structure eased into the water. The comments section was already overflowing. People called it poetic justice, the perfect metaphor for entitlement meeting its match. Someone had added dramatic music, another had turned it into a short meme. The internet had taken over, and there was no stopping it. By the end of the week, local news stations began calling. A reporter from Channel 6 wanted to do an interview about the homeowner who reclaimed his land in the most creative way possible. I declined politely, not wanting to add fuel to the fire, but the story kept spreading anyway. Articles with headlines like "HOA Nightmare Ends in Floating Garage" appeared online, and talk show hosts joked about it during their morning segments. Karen, meanwhile, stayed silent. Her blinds remained drawn, and her car didn't leave the driveway for days. The same neighbors who once whispered in fear now walked past her house without hesitation. Someone even installed a small wooden sign by the lake that read, "Community Dock." No one claimed responsibility, but I had a good idea who it might have been. Watching it all unfold felt strange. The chaos that had once filled my life was now entertainment for millions. Yet, beneath the humor and the headlines, there was something satisfying about the balance it brought. Karen had spent months twisting rules to suit herself, and in the end, she had created the very spectacle that destroyed her authority. Her garage had become more than a structure. It was a story, and for once, the story belonged to me. A week after the video went viral, a White County vehicle pulled into my driveway. The man who stepped out introduced himself as Inspector Holloway from the Department of Building and Land Use. He carried a clipboard, wore mirrored sunglasses, and looked like someone who had seen every kind of neighborhood dispute. "We've had a few reports about a structure in the lake," he said. His voice was calm, polite, and almost amused. "Mind if I take a look?" I walked him down to the shoreline. The garage floated quietly where it had settled, framed by morning light. The water around it had gone still again, reflecting the structure so clearly that it looked like there were two of them. Holloway stood with his hands on his hips, studying it for a long time before he spoke. "Well," he said, "that's new. I explained everything from the beginning. The unauthorized construction, the survey results, the police report, and the relocation." He listened without interrupting, occasionally jotting something down. When I finished, he nodded slowly. "You documented all of this?" I handed him the folder with copies of every photo and form I had saved. He flipped through the pages, then gave a short laugh. "You might be the most thorough homeowner I've ever met." He took a few pictures of the floating garage and made a couple of measurements. When he was done, he turned toward me with a faint grin. "Technically, there's nothing illegal here. It's not connected to the land, and it isn't blocking any waterways. From a regulatory standpoint, it's just an anchored object on private property." He closed his clipboard with a snap. "I've seen worse things end up in lakes after storms. Consider this one of the more creative resolutions I've ever encountered." Karen must have been watching from her window, because by the time the inspector left, she was outside demanding answers. "You're going to fine him, aren't you?" she asked. Holloway looked at her, then back at me. "Ma'am, no laws have been broken," he said simply. She sputtered, trying to find a response, but none came. The inspector climbed into his truck and drove away, leaving her standing by the water, speechless. I couldn't help but smile as the quiet returned. The lake had claimed her garage, and now even the law agreed it belonged there. The meeting that decided Karen's fate took place on a Wednesday evening at the community clubhouse. For once, she wasn't the one leading it. The board had called an emergency session to address what they delicately described as a series of leadership concerns. The parking lot was packed long before the meeting began. People who had never attended an HOA event before showed up that night, some carrying folders, others carrying coffee, most wearing expressions that suggested they were finally ready to say what they had held in for years. Inside, the air felt thick with anticipation. Karen sat near the front, her binder open, flipping through pages she no longer controlled. Her friends, the two board members who had always voted with her, looked uncomfortable. The chairperson, a retired teacher named Evelyn, cleared her throat and began the session. "We are here to discuss whether current HOA leadership has acted in the best interests of this community," she said. Her tone was calm but firm. "There will be time for public comment." One by one, neighbors stood and spoke. A man from the corner house described how Karen had fined him for installing a fence she had previously approved. A woman recalled receiving a violation for having a child's bicycle left in the driveway. Another neighbor mentioned the megaphone announcements and how they had turned the peaceful mornings into noise. Each story chipped away at the authority Karen had built over the years. When it was my turn, I kept it brief. I showed a printed photo of the garage floating peacefully on the lake. "This," I said, "is what happens when power goes unchecked." A few people chuckled softly, but the point landed. Karen's face went pale. After nearly 2 hours of discussion, Evelyn called for a vote. The result was decisive. 3 in favor of her removal, 2 opposed. The room erupted in quiet applause. Karen stood slowly, closing her binder as if it were the end of a long play that had lost its audience. She didn't speak. She walked out without looking at anyone, the door swinging shut behind her with a sound that felt final. The silence that followed was almost peaceful. For the first time since I had moved there, Whispering Shores felt like a neighborhood again, not a kingdom. The days after the meeting felt strangely calm. For the first time since I moved to Whispering Shores, the mornings arrived without announcements or threats. The neighborhood that had once felt tense began to loosen its shoulders. People lingered outside longer, waved more easily, and even stopped to talk without glancing over their shoulders. The air itself seemed lighter, as though the sound of Karen's voice had been pressing down on it all along. I spent most of my time by the water. The lake had become my favorite place again, not a stage for confrontation, but a quiet refuge. The garage still floated there, though the surface had grown soft with moss along the edges. It looked less like an act of defiance now, and more like an accidental monument. Children from nearby houses sometimes paddled their canoes close to it, laughing as they touched the side. Nobody stopped them. The structure that had once divided the community had become a curiosity, a harmless reminder of how strange life could be when pride went unchecked. Carl came by one afternoon, carrying 2 folding chairs and a pair of fishing rods. "Figured it's about time we used this lake for something peaceful," he said. We sat for hours, casting lines into the still water, talking about everything except Karen. The conversation drifted easily, full of small stories and long pauses. At one point, he looked toward the floating garage and smiled. "You know," he said, "I think people are actually grateful. You didn't just fix a property dispute, You gave this place a fresh start." It was true. The HOA had appointed new members, people who wanted to focus on maintenance instead of punishment. The rules still existed, but they were treated like guidelines instead of weapons. I started to see neighbors helping each other again, sharing tools, exchanging advice about gardens, and inviting me to gatherings I hadn't even known they held before. In the evenings, I would sit on the porch and watch the sun sink behind the trees. The garage glowed softly in the fading light, half submerged but perfectly balanced. It was no longer a symbol of chaos or revenge. It was just part of the landscape, a quiet reminder that peace often comes not from winning a battle, but from deciding when it's finally over. A few months passed, and the story of the floating garage began to fade from the public eye. The internet found new dramas to obsess over, and the lake slowly returned to its natural rhythm. The waterline rose slightly with the spring rain, and the structure shifted closer to the dock, creaking softly whenever the wind moved across the surface. I had thought about dismantling it more than once, but every time I tried to plan it, something stopped me. It felt wrong to erase it. The garage had become part of the place, as much a piece of whispering shores as the pine trees and the water itself. One morning, I noticed a group of visitors walking along the trail near the lake. They were carrying cameras and sketchbooks, pointing at the structure as if they had discovered something profound. When I asked what brought them out here, one of them introduced herself as an art curator from a small gallery downtown. She explained that someone had sent her photos of the garage, calling it a striking example of unintentional installation art. She smiled and asked if I would be willing to let the gallery feature it in an upcoming exhibit about reclaimed spaces. At first, I thought she was joking, but a week later, she returned with a formal proposal and a check. The gallery wanted to document the piece, display photographs, and eventually purchase the structure for relocation. They called it Entitlement Submerged. The title made me laugh, but it also felt right. The garage had started as a monument to arrogance and ended as a story about consequence. When the crew arrived to move it, I stood by the dock and watched as they worked. The process was quiet and respectful, nothing like the chaos that had surrounded its first move. As the truck carried it away, I felt something loosen in my chest. It was the end of a chapter that had lasted far longer than I ever expected. The gallery sent me the payment a few days later, and I used part of it to build a small wooden deck where the garage had once floated. On summer nights, I sit there with a drink in hand, the water calm beneath me, and I think about how peace can grow from the strangest roots. And that, my friends, is how I turned a neighbor's arrogance into waterfront property and internet history. If you've made it this far, you deserve a medal, or at least a stress-free neighborhood. Remember, boundaries exist for a reason, especially the literal kind. Smash that subscribe button for more tales of karma served late cold. Comment your wildest HOA horror story. And never forget, when a Karen builds her empire on your land, sometimes the best revenge is relocation. See you next story, folks, and may all your property lines stay drama-free.